It's not unusual when we try to make our case from sound reasoning and logic and the laws of logic, like the law of non-contradiction, of the law of excluded middle, or the law of identity, or some other um, what appears to most, I think, to be self-evident principles of reason, that someone will dismiss this by saying, well, the laws of logic and the laws of reason are mere human inventions. And therefore, you can't take a mere human invention and use it to inveigh against anybody or anybody's point of view, because it's just the way you decide to define things. This is a kind of a postmodernist approach. It certainly isn't a modernist challenge to Christian ideas, because they trade on logic to make their points. But ironically, so do postmodernists. Even when making this point, they have to employ the same principles in order to make the point that these principles don't consistently apply. So there's a kind of a suicide lurking in the background of this argument. If the argument works to defeat our view, it equally works to defeat theirs. And I think part of the problem here is that the claim simply is false, that the laws of logic are foundational features of reality that we discover, that we don't just invent. They're not conventions. A convention is like, what side of the plate do you put the fork? Do you put it on the left side or the right side? Do you eat at a table or do you eat on the floor? Some cultures do one thing, some do the other. They are different conventions. These are human inventions that can be changed without doing any violence anywhere. It's just a different opinion about things. So my question is, if the laws of logic are human inventions, conventions that could be changed, then what does it look like to change them? Why don't we just decide that the law of identity, which says that a thing is itself and not something else, that A is equal to A, let's just say, well, we're going to change that rule because we can. Now what does it look like? A thing is not identical to itself. In other words, I am not me. Well, then what am I? I mean, do you see how ridiculous that is? This is just one illustration, one example to demonstrate that these laws are not as flexible as people think. And there's a reason why. Because they're not inventions. We don't invent the laws of logic, we discover it. And forgive me for reading this piece to you, but I have actually responded in a little longer way, but I think in a coherent way, to this broader challenge in our Stand to Reason booklet, The Ambassador's Guide to Postmodernism. And here's what I said. Some things are basic and indispensable to certain enterprises. If you want to communicate using language, for example, you're pretty much going to have to use subjects and verbs to do so. That's because of the nature of communication, that it entails particular things, subjects, engaged in some sort of action, verbs. That's what we talk about. Notice that it doesn't matter what language one speaks, what culture one is from, that is, what conventions one has adopted regarding language, or what period of history one lives in, because moderns use subjects and predicates doesn't mean this is a distinctively modern practice to be rejected, along with any of modernism's vices, real or imagined. Ancients used them too, because they were essential to communication. They were not accidental characteristics of some particular way of talking. And all linguistic communication works this same way because of how reality is structured. Subjects and verbs are essential to communication, given the nature of communication itself. And in the same way, some things are basic and essential to discursive thought. The principles of reason are among them. They are brute facts of the world, obvious to anyone willing to take time to reflect on them. Even those who don't know the term law of non-contradiction certainly know the concept. No one taught them this. They picked it up through contact with reality. Because God made each of us with the faculty to recognize these features of the world, we subconsciously employ the principles and frequently recognize violations of them, regardless of our native language or our culture. In other words, regardless of our convention. Indeed, anyone attempting to refute the laws of reason must employ them in the process. So I think this is enough to demonstrate that the laws of logic, including those I just mentioned, are not inventions. the simple fact is, if they were, we could change them at a whim. But we can't, and that seems obvious. This ought to put to rest the claim that laws of logic, laws of reason, are simply inventions of human beings, and therefore don't have any authority in the discussion about the nature of reality. It's not the case.